because we do children's ministry and children's programs here, we have a training program that's required for all those who are going to serve in children's ministries. This training that we're doing today is derived out of our child protection policy, which the trustees oversee and maintain, and which is summarized in a couple of places if you want to have a reference once we break up from here, because it's easier than these slides. This is a summary, but in the appendix O of our Roots Manual, which is available under resources on our website, you can find a summary, and then you can find additional summaries in the yellow pamphlets that sit out in our little pamphlet center that have some of the, again, summary versions of some of the policies for both specific to nursery and then for child policies as is. So just for those who are new, we do require that any who are going to be involved here with church-sponsored ministry to children go through this training. It's only required face-to-face on the very first time. So a new member who would be coming to join would be required to do a face-to-face conversation. And then afterward, you're required to do refresher training every 2 years. And I think the process of trying to enable that through online is still ongoing. You can see that we're being videoed this morning in an effort to create another good video presentation that people can review on their own cycle. We do ask that everybody monitor sort of your own qualification and standing. Although Emma works that on behalf of the trustees in the office, it's a big thing for her to keep track of. So if you could help, we'll help each other in doing that. As I've said in previous years, our purpose this morning is not really to create paranoia or a police state, but it's to inform and to remind ourselves of what we said we're going to do in the prayerful consideration of trying to avoid any kind of abuse situation from happening here within our body. We do have to always remember that it's our sovereign God that's in control of the affairs of men, and so we're going to do our part by trying to be diligent and vigilant and recognize that God is sovereign and in control of what's happening. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, the goal of this training is to prevent any sort of abusive situations happening amongst our children during our activities here within our local assembly, as well as the activities our body participates in away from this campus. We do quite a bit of that. We've done more of that lately, but these are also things that will apply away from the campus when we are doing things as part of SAYSF Bible Church. It's not intended for you to go take this and implement it at your school or go and take and implement it on your street, your neighborhood. You can take these principles. I think they're very good and godly ones, but that's its intent. We started this morning in prayer, and you can see that listed as the top. These are sort of 5 activities, if you will, that are associated with trying to create an environment that's protects us or tries to protect or tries to minimize the likelihood of having this happen. The first, of course, is prayer, which we opened in. And recognizing, of course, that it is God who's got to be in all of this for it to work. It's got to be God through the Holy Spirit transforming our hearts for the evil that lies in there that brings these things to pass. And it's got to be us petitioning God constantly on a basis to hedge around and protect the ministries that are here against the evil that we're guaranteed will come. So it's not a biblical worldview to think that we're going to fully keep evil out, but we are expected to be diligent and be protected and to watch and to try and minimize that, trusting in God that He will use that. Another really important reason why prayer is at the top of this list is that the whole program, all the measures that we implement here for this are very contingent on this idea of submitting to one another and being accountable to one another. And if we have a hard time submitting and being accountable to God in prayer, we're really going to have a hard time doing it with each other as sinful men, imperfect and sinful men and women. So it's really a very key part of this, both individually in prayer, as parents for our children, as workers for those with whom we work, but for the church as a whole, even if when we're gathered for times of prayer. The next step that you see, next bullet down there, says policies. So prayerfully, consulting with the scriptures for the principles in there, and with the requirements of the law of the land, we then develop policies. I mentioned earlier that we work under this child protection policy that the trustees oversee for all of us here. So that's sort of the overarching policy, and there's some appendices, if you will, and some various sub-policies under that. But that's the first thing, is to turn those into some policies which give us a guidance framework for how to do things. And then each ministry leader or ministry function or group, then inside the framework of those policies, develop procedures given the specifics of how that ministry operates. It's what goes on in the sound booth ministry group is different than what happens with our youth ministry as they go off and do adventures off campus, right? So those leaders have to take those policies and generate procedures for implementation based on the specifics of those ministries. And there. Then, of course, once we've got some policies and procedures down there, we need to do what we're doing now. We need to do teaching of the new who join our body and help them to understand these things, why we have them in place, what they are, which we're doing this morning, and then also to remind ourselves, right? That's why we have this periodic requirement, so that we remind ourselves, oh yeah, that's right, we do this, and here's why, and here are the things that we do. But really, all of it is wonderful, and it's an excellent administrative exercise, but it requires personal and collective vigilance and alertness, right? And being sober and alert, because our enemy prowls around like a lion, seeking whom he will devour, right? And what a great way to devour a church than to have an abuse incident go on in that church. That will absolutely devour the church. Even the allegation of such an incident will devour a church. So that requires our individual and our collective vigilance to make that a reality. So here's some of the strategies that go behind our policies here, just general approaches to creating a abuse-free environment. The first, of course, that I just mentioned was this vigilance and this alertness, this being sober-minded that we hear in Scripture. And it really, truly is the best defense. The classic MO of a person who is going to commit an abuse act is that they're trying to blend in, be unnoticed. They're trying to find a place where they can maneuver without a lot of oversight. So attentive people, all of us, each of us, being attentive to the other people around us is really the best defense. Now, the issue with that is all of you are very servant-minded and very busy, and we're running around hither and yon, and we're all gathered around making sure the sound's good, and making sure the lights are on, making sure the cups are ready for communion, and making sure our message is ready, and making sure that the music's synced up. So it's very much of a challenge to really maintain that alertness and vigilance when we come and gather together in the morning, because we tend to have a lot of responsibilities. People are generally very busy. And then the other part of that is there's a dimension of us that come, and this is their only peaceful break in the week. Their 90 minutes of peace in their whole 167 hours is when they step foot on this campus. And so the last thing their heart is looking for is to walk in and be on guard, on alert, right? They want to come in and they want to be at peace, and they want to be ministered to or minister to others in a peaceful, joyful environment. But it does take all of those things to be safe. We do all each need to be attentive. In that vein, or a specific implementation of that, is the engagement of strangers. For the reasons I mentioned about the profile of people who tend to be abusers, they don't tend to walk in and say, I'm a really bad person and I've come here to do evil against the children in your group. That's not generally how that works, right? And so they tend to want to go and not be noticed in there. And so one thing that people often say about us is that we're very friendly, we're very engaging, but that isn't universally so. And I've had many opportunity where I'll walk up to somebody who's supposed to be at the job of greeting or welcoming new people. I said, who's that over in the corner? I said, I don't know, never seen him, or whatever. And so we should, as we're here, and even though we're in our busyness and running around, for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of the fellowship, if nothing else, have a heart to say, I don't really know who that person is, but I'm going to make some time right now to go engage them. The challenge of that is we often come and we want to fellowship and encourage one another. We want to invest in each other when we're all gathered here, right? And that's got to be a balance, because that is a function of the church, is to do those things. But we also really need to be tuned into, gee, the Lord brought that person here, or the Lord hasn't brought that person and I together yet. I should go get to know them a little bit, okay? So a key strategy in all of this is you need to engage those you don't already know. Administrative controls. So the one you see on bullet number 3 there is to screen our workers. So we do that as those of you who, there are several I see out there who have recently been through the Roots class. As you come through the Roots class and you say, yes, I want to move forward into membership with SAYSF Bible Church. If you have any inclination that you're going to do children's ministry, part of what you are saying when you say you want to join is that you submit to a background check and a screening of your suitability to make sure that we know who we're getting and what we're getting when it comes time to put people into children's ministry. And that goes back to that earlier point I made about submitting one to another. Some people sort of chafe under that idea, but that is one of those ideas of we're going to submit to one another in humility so that we can serve together in security and safety to the degree that we can. Kind of the next administrative control comes a lot on the planners and the leaders. And that is that our policy says that each who is in a position of leadership that has anything to do with ministering to children is going to make a plan as part of their activity map and their schedule and everything. They're going to make a deliberate plan for prevention, right? And we'll talk about some of the principles for that plan. So as we're doing all the many administrative functions we do to coordinate, schedule, and organize, and do personnel and everything, part of that as the folks who are involved on a leadership side in those things is to say, okay, I'm also going to put my plan together with these prevention principles that I'll outline on the next slide. The 5th strategy listed up there has to do with controlling access to the campus. Now it seems like a really strange idea for a church reaching out to our neighborhood and being available to all these people, but it is a key tenet of that. And so it's possible to control access and keep sort of a secure site without being unfriendly or unwelcoming. Okay, that's reasonable to do, and it goes back to that idea of vigilance. We have a lot of great saints here who make it their point and serve our body by making sure once the dust is settled and people move on, to go around and make sure things are secure and tied up and the fire doors are closed and all that in an effort to both protect the facility but also to protect the people, right? So that only the people who should be here at certain times really can get here and have access. We have keys. Hopefully when you got that key, you signed for that key and you were made to understand that you don't have the freedom to give that key to whomever you wish. You have no freedom to make a copy of that key without seeking that from somebody else. Okay, so those are some of the key tenets of keeping the campus secure in there. So controlling access. Talk about this idea of a prevention triad. This is kind of a handy little memory device tool that can be used in both the planning stages when we talked about your planning for prevention, and then also in the execution real time as it's happening part of any of the ministries that are going on here. So it's a pretty good tool, and they're really kind of the same concept sort of expressed in 3 little bumper stickers up there. And the first, of course, is this idea of balancing power, right? So fundamentally, because we're talking about adults working with children, there's an imbalance of power. We adults are far more cunning, far more capable of great evil. We have often greater physical strength and a lot more experience. So there's a built-in imbalance of power that we have to take some procedural steps and some planning steps to try and bring into balance. If you're going to hire a babysitter over for your small children, and you're given the choice between the offensive lineman or the tackle or the grandmother, you might tend to choose the grandmother. It's just a natural way that our intuition goes towards balancing power. A means of that, or another implementation of that on the triad here, is this idea of avoiding isolation. Okay, remember we talked about the demeanor of the person who is inclined or historically has committed abuse tends to seek isolation, right? Because we know that people can't see everywhere. Sometimes we lose track of the fact that God can see everywhere. But probably if this is in someone's heart, they're not that worried about it. But so avoiding isolation and creating a plan or a program as we consider an event, say, that really consciously thinks about this. Am I, because of the way I'm setting things up, creating, mechanizing in my plans, isolation? Or am I creating a plan and mechanization that avoids isolation, right? So here's an example of a way that we do this to a degree. When we have large combined events, like say Easter or something over there, we historically tend to try and bring some of the kids' functions over into that same building, so there isn't this long path going over to a far different corner of the campus for people to go, and then this far path for them to go back with lots of opportunity for isolation. Not perfect, right? And it's going to be a balance every time, but that concept helps us to try and think about, we're going to try and not structure things so that we have ways for people to go off and be on their own. Again, and that comes, that not being isolated comes in the idea of keeping accountable, right? But it has to be sort of deliberate accountability. We've seen lots in the news where there have been horrible atrocities committed to people right in the middle of a huge throng of people. Hundreds of witnesses. So being in public, which we say is not isolated, don't confuse those two, right? We've got lots of things that you can be in a large group of people and be very isolated or not have accountability. So accountability is something that's got to be mutual, right? Both parties have to agree to some accountability for there really to be accountability. So as we plan these things, as we work on personnel, as we try and get people together, we have to communicate our consent one to another for accountability in this work, right? And that's part of what we're doing now. By being here, you're consenting that you're going to be accountable to each other and to the rest of the body here for your work in children's ministry and to keep an environment that's free of abuse. And so not only can you plan it, but you can kind of monitor these things. So here I am, practical application. Here I am, I'm signed up. Oh, I'm going to have nursery today. And so I plug down there. I'm going to be, nursery is pretty structured. We tend to have a space and we have a place and a pattern. But how about something a little less so, like maybe vacation Bible school? So we're going to go, we got kids hither and yon, and we got stations everywhere, and it's about my time to go beyond there. I can, even though we try to make a plan for that event that it addresses these things, now as I go to work in that event, I've got these running through my mind. So I'm kind of constantly monitoring as I'm doing my things. Am I avoiding isolation, right? Am I trying to make steps to avoid isolation? Have I kept accountability with somebody? Hey, coworker, these two kids and I are going to go over here for a second. I'll be back in a minute. If you don't hear from me, check on me. Roger that. I'll look for you. Okay, got it. We just made accountability with one another in there, trying to keep things balanced when we can. So here's kind of a summary of our child protection policy here at SAYSF. The first is that it's ultimately the parent's responsibility. The safety of or the guardian, the safety of the minors, the children, teens and children, are ultimately the responsibility of the parents and the guardians there. Which is to say that while we offer a huge amount of, or a fairly extensive amount of children's ministries and programs and things, none of them are compulsory. There is no expectation at this body, at this church, for you to ever have to part ways with your children while you come here to worship and participate. Right? That is your choice as a parent to do that. We are willing to have contingent upon and sometimes mutual group concurrence to have children there, but they're not compulsory. We do not require you to part ways with your kids, and therefore you're always welcome to keep them, and therefore you're always responsible for their safety and well-being. So if you're not comfortable with how the system is here, our policies, that's okay. You don't have to use them. You can keep control of your children all the time. But we like to try and create an environment that allows that to happen. That change of responsibility, if it is, or that deference, is contingent upon parents making a positive, two-way accountability with the person who's going to be caring for their child, right? So that means that they're going to a class or a nursery place. A parent has to come and say, you now have responsibility for my child for this time, or I'm delegating, or I'm giving that to you, I'm willing to do that. And that person has to say, okay, I'm now going to do that, right? That has not been achieved when a child is brought to a room where an event will occur in the future and left there. That two-way positive change of responsibility didn't happen, right? So that doesn't work. It's got to be, I'm checking them in, okay, I've got them, okay, I've got them back, parent, okay, you got them back, they're yours now, right? I know that's cumbersome, I know that's administratively difficult, but that's the basis of the whole system. All right, so that's kind of the summary of the parent responsibility. Categories and qualifications. In our policies, we kind of make 3 distinctions on people based on their age. We call people who are 12 and under children, for the purposes of this discussion, 13 through 17, not yet 18, as teenagers, and those who are 18 years old and over as adults for the purposes of this. So adults and teens can become authorized youth workers, children workers, in these various children ministries. Adults must be members of the church, right? They've gone through the membership process, and they have to have gotten submitted to and completed a background check and undergone this training. So those are the 3 things required from an adult to serve as in children's ministry. Teens, those 13 to not yet 17, have to be recommended for it, and then some other authorized worker has to say, yep, I can vouch for them. I think they'd be a good children's worker. Okay, it cannot just be mom and dad. Somebody else who has had a period of observation has to say, we also are good with them in there. Now, what about teens and kids who don't want to be an authorized children worker but want to go with mom and dad when they're doing it? As long as mom and dad can maintain positive control and oversight of their kids, they can co-work together. We like families to labor together, but there has to be that element of, for instance, if I brought my children in with me to nursery who are above nursery age but not teenagers, I have to be able to maintain positive control of them and monitor what they're doing. I can't just turn them loose to do that, but they can labor alongside as long as they're properly supervised. Of course, all the prevention triad tools apply, and they also apply to those you're going to bring in, like your mother-in-law who's visiting and wants to sit with you or whatever. They have to be, in all those triad things, they have to be positively supervised to make that happen. Talked about background check. Safety in numbers, we sort of already addressed in the standpoint that just because there are a number of people around does not explicitly generate lack of isolation and accountability. It has to be coordinated and arranged. And we do have some policies for campus access that we've talked about a little bit there. The big one is that children, as discussed here, are not supposed to be alone, unsupervised on the campus. Okay? So they should be supervised at some time. Now, does that mean they have to be with their Sunday school teacher? No. Supervision can be arranged family to family, right? So you can say, the Fosters are out with the De Leons. Hey, Ray, we're going to go do this thing. Would you watch my kid for 5 minutes? Yes, I will. I've accepted responsibility. We'll go off and come back, right? That's arranged between us out there. Again, the parents are accepting responsibility for how that works out. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, the policies by themselves won't create prevention. They have to be applied with some diligence and some care. All right, so procedures we talked about. As ministry leaders, and we discussed this earlier, making their plans, which really have a lot to do with schedules, right? There are some things that are listed in our policies for how the schedule has to be written for accountability, to build in accountability. And one key element of that is that as it stands, our current policy that a couple, a married couple, do not count as 2 people. There has to be some outside person to bring accountability for that. So while we love to have families and married couples serve with the children, there must be a third qualified person in there to bring the element of accountability required. Additionally, the check-in, check-out sheet or attendance sheet process is how we document that sort of positive change of who's got responsibility at the time in there, and so that's kind of the record of accountability. So that needs to be done, and that requires both the workers to be careful about that. In a busy time, people are coming in, you're trying to greet kids, you're trying to do a bunch of things, and oh, by the way, would you make sure you sign the sign-in sheet? It's busy, I acknowledge that. Everyone does. But it also requires those who are bringing their children in to be diligent about doing that part, right? So we have a record. Who is with who when? Okay, that protects the workers, that protects the parents, that protects the children. It's a key element of what goes on there. Bathroom breaks, there should be some degree for children, there should be some degree of supervision, but not complete isolation with somebody supervising them as they go to and from the bathroom. So that should be a group event. or it should be one of those things where I'm going to stand here, I'm going to watch you walk in, I'm going to count to 30 seconds or 40, and I should see you walk out, right? That kind of implementation when it comes to doing bathroom breaks. Shouldn't be the, sure, Susie, go down the hall and we'll see you when you get back. Courtyard monitoring. We kind of talked about that, but in one of our procedures is specifically because we had that big crossroads down there at the back where everybody's switching buildings all at one place, that we've sort of covenanted together as those who are involved in children's ministry to keep an eye on those proceedings, because that's the place where there's the biggest turnover and changeover and kids amok and parents amok and everybody churning around. So that place is one in particular that we watch without a watchful. It's not a thing where we've designated specific people. Okay, it's Sunday the 29th and you're responsible to monitor the crossing there. We ask that all who are in the children's ministry, as they have occasion to be there, pay attention to that as we go. So despite everybody's, not just SAYSF, but across, where schools and every place else where there's a lot of attention given to these, bad things happen. And evil things do take place, and across the nation it works out to be about 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys in their lifetime, in their childhood if you will, or in their lifetime, will be abused. And it's demographic blind. It doesn't care what your demographic is, and the sad fact is that a huge majority, they say about 85%, all know and trust their attacker. So these things are committed by people that are in positions of intimacy and trust in here, and that's what makes it such a devastating thing. The next couple of slides, I'm not trying to disturb you or anything, I'm just going to review some of the various forms of abuse and some of their symptoms so that you might be aware and potentially recognize causes for concern if we have any of our charges. These are dramatic photos, but neglect tends to be insidious because often it takes a long time for it to manifest, and it can be ongoing for a great amount of time before a observable negative result occurs. You can see here some of what we probably think about it would be things like poor hygiene, possibly squinting from obvious problems with the senses that don't look like they're being treated, clothes that don't seem to quite fit the person and are not quite in the condition you would have normally expected. Ongoing untreated illness or injury, and that some of the behavioral indicators would be like chronic absenteeism, chronic hunger, tiredness, lethargy, or lots of begging for leftovers and things like that, things that you would think of. Again, in going over some of these signs and symptoms, the idea is not that we're going to become experts and clinicians. We're trying to be alert to recognize behaviors that might give us a cause to go, I wonder if that's normal, or if there's a reason to be concerned there. One that is also on here is over-assumption of adult responsibilities, right? So we've got kids that do a lot of these things and they're perfectly normal, healthy, and well cared for, right? So it's got to be kind of a preponderance of things that lead you to the conclusion that there might be cause for further concern. Classically, we think of physical abuse, but I will tell you that I think in the body of Christ, universal, this is probably least likely because of the external evidence, right? Because you're going to walk out in front of a bunch of people on Sunday morning and somebody's going to ask about Susie or Johnny's whatever, boo-boo that's there. So what's important about physical abuse is the idea that it's non-accidental and it results in an injury or threatens an injury, okay? So at least in the eyes of the law of the land, menacing physical assault is physical abuse, even if there's no contact made with the person, right? So that's something there. Again, the physical indicators would be what you would expect. There would be injury associated with that. Sometimes untreated injury. Emotional symptoms would include guardedness, fear, apprehension, distance, maintaining distance, those sorts of things. It might be physical abuse exhibited by the child. He might be a physically abusive person. Emotional abuse and mental abuse, a lot like neglect, doesn't leave a bruise, doesn't leave a mark. Oftentimes hard to notice right off the bat. Most often shows up in behavioral things. With older kids, it sometimes results in self-physical abuse, which you've heard lots of cases of. Otherwise, it tends to be, being withdrawn, staying back, isolating, or conversely, being emotionally abusive to other people, being unnaturally affectionate, almost even sexual in there can sometimes be a compensation for that. Emotional and mental abuse in the eyes of the state includes things like verbal threats, harsh speech, criticism, and ridicule. So drawing the line on that sometimes can be a fine. Universally, the most sensational and offensive is the idea of sexual abuse, and that's defined as any physical contact or any physical contact that's for sexual gratification, even if it's mental sexual gratification, not physical sexual gratification. Classically, that's what we're thinking when people are thinking of child abuse. Physical symptoms can include difficulties with doing bathroom functions, indications of sexual assault in clothing or on the physical body. It can include inappropriate interest in sexual things at a young age. It can, again, hiding and fear and all the negative responses that you would expect can be in there as well. Another behavior can be graphic speech, a lot of graphic talk about sexual things that aren't really age appropriate in there. So those are just a brief overview of some of those things. So what do you do as a child worker if you suspect you've looked at these things, you're kind of like, gosh, I remember what Brett said, and it seems like there's some issues here. We talked earlier about vigilance, and here's one of the key reasons why. It's at that very first interaction with the parent or guardian that you want to be super alert. And so some strategies for doing that is, particularly if you're like a Sunday school teacher or something like that, if you can get all your stuff that you're going to present, all the other things you're responsible for wired well ahead of time, you have some spare capacity at that moment to be in the moment and notice the condition of the child and be able to catch that and interact with the parent. So it is very good to protect the worker and also the parent to kind of let them know, or the guardian, to say, hey, I don't remember Johnny's boo-boo, or wow, does Johnny play soccer? That's a pretty sizable bruise or whatever. But some acknowledgement as you're at that time of handoff gives you the ability to look that parent or guardian in the eye and express that you guys have both now communicated on this pre-existing condition when they came into your care, right? That boo-boo didn't happen on your watch. It also, you'll tend to get a pretty good idea of where they're coming from by how they react to you acknowledging that. And you can see in their countenance whether that troubles them or whether they withdraw from you or whatever the case may be. So it's very important, particularly when you go on duty, to do that. If you happen to miss something or whatever, somebody was already there when you came on duty, and you happen to notice something, you want to potentially confer with your co-worker, your other child worker, about it, unless you have strong reason to believe that that might be the person who committed the offense. And even then, it's probably good to say, hey, Susie over here, gosh, that looks like a pretty new wound. Did you notice that when they came in? Or something to that effect, right? And so again, if you both came on, or maybe they were like, oh yeah, I talked to their parents about it when they came in, happened at their home, whatever. But anyway, talk with a coworker. If you're apprehensive about that, we have lots of people in the audience and in our congregation who are experts. They're trained in the schools, they're trained by the healthcare department, they're trained as medical professionals who really have depth, maybe more than you do. You can say, let's walk everybody up to the lobby or go see if we can find somebody that can find Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so and have them come and visit our classroom today so they can have a look. If it really comes to it, the situation dictates, you may have to actually inquire of the child themselves, and the circumstances will give you some indication whether that's going to be needed. Just a caution that if their child has been through an abusive trauma event, they're going to relive that as they share it with you. So you want to do that in such a way that not only is your isolation avoided and your accountability protected by your other worker in the class there, but in a private sense so that it's not a big scene in front of the other kids and upsetting to them and privacy is violated. So that's kind of a tricky thing to do. I would approach that with caution, but if you need it, that would be a great time to try and go locate a third person to be sort of your expert and come in and take a look. In all cases, if you, based on the accumulation of circumstances or indications, whatever, really suspect that there's some abuse, it's obligation to report. Okay? We are obligated to report those things. So what does that mean exactly? If you perceive that there is abuse and if you perceive an immediate safety concern or a definite, maybe not immediate in time, but there's a definite pressing safety concern for the child, report to the police. You do not have to, key principle is, you don't have to come find anybody else to make that report. You may pick up your phone and dial 911 and call the police. Now, some wisdom would be, don't do that alone. Find somebody who's with you when you make the call, because when they call in to report a murder, who's the first person always suspected? The person making the call, right? I just found my husband dead with my knife in his back. Okay. So take that as counsel. If you do not perceive that there's an immediate pressing safety concern, then to the degree that time will allow, our recommendation is confer some with some others before you go into reporting. Larry, you're going to have to correct me on this, but I was under the principle that if you're a designated pastor or minister, you have privilege in these things, but you told me that's not true. So that was bad information that was put out years past. So recognize that as you go and confer with others to do this, that no one is protected under any form of privilege, whether you're clergy or not, with that. But we still need to do confer. And again, those process of trying to confer with the parent ahead of time or at the end of the time when you're returning Johnny. Hey, I noticed, we were playing with Johnny and they had a hard time walking. Did you know that? Have you seen that before? So that there's acknowledgement in there. From the leadership perspective, we would rather call and go through all the churn of having a police unit come here and have it be a false alarm than the other case of feeling like not wanting to cause a scene, because the scene that will come for an abuse situation that didn't get reported and didn't get dealt with is going to be much bigger than anything that will come from a false alarm. So the biblical principles of Matthew 18 in the non-urgent cases are good guidance for addressing the person, bringing a witness, bringing it to others in the church. And that is the completion of what I have for you today.